Welcome. Thank you, James. I was about to say. Um, Hello and welcome to the first Digital History seminar of the 24-25 academic year. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. If you haven't seen yet, we have a fantastic range of papers and speakers planned for this year, alongside our popular postgraduate panel. And so please do visit our website to see the full seminar programme, and also sign up to our newsletter if you haven't already done so. You can do that via our website to receive updates on the next seminar. Tonight, we are hearing from Ashley R. Sanders on identifying latent textual bias, making a case for traditional NLP tasks in the era of AI. We will hear around half an hour by Ashley, and then we will have some time for questions. So if you have any as you go, please do put them in the chat and we will come to them at the end. And there's also an opportunity to ask your questions via the microphone if you would like to. But I will just introduce Ashley now before handing over to her. So Ashley is a multidisciplinary data scientist. She served as vice chair of the Digital Humanities program at UCLA for more than 6 years, and prior to that as a faculty member and director of the Digital Research Studio at the Claremont Colleges. She holds a PhD in history with a specialization in digital humanities and a Bachelor of Science in mathematics and history. Her first book, Visualizing History's Fragments, a computational approach to humanistic research, is now available from Palgrave, and also publications include Silent No More, Women as Significant Political Intermediaries in Ottoman Algeria. She's also been awarded a large national endowment for the humanities grant in collaboration with a co-PI, Jessica Otis at George Mason University, for their project entitled The Mathematical Humanists. The grant funds a series of in-person, online, and asynchronous professional development workshops on statistics, graphs and networks, linear algebra, and discrete mathematic methods that inform computational humanistic research methods. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Ashley. What an accolade and introduction that biography is. So we're really, really excited to have you here tonight and to hear from you. So I will hand over to you now if you'd like to share your slides. And as I say, if you have any questions as we go, please do put them in the chat.
Hey, wonderful. Thank you all so much for being here. I know that you have many options and evenings are often a crowded time, and time is very precious. So I really appreciate you joining us either synchronously or maybe you're watching this later on YouTube. So welcome. I've got the title of the talk here, Identifying Latent Textual Bias, Making a Case for Traditional NLP Tasks in the Era of AI. And my contact information, I haven't quite killed my Twitter account yet. I'm still sort of emotionally attached to it. So you can still find me on Twitter, now known as X, as well as Instagram. And at the end of my slides, I've also got my email address there as well. If you have questions, you want to talk, chat, I provide consulting on DH or data science projects. So if you have questions, I'm happy to talk further. So I'm going to begin with a quote from one of the sources for my research, and then I'll explain how this fits into the larger project. So this quote comes from a French author who was writing in 1887 about Algeria and the Ottoman Algerian past. So he wrote, Hajj Ali was ignorant and fanatic like his predecessor. Somber, surly, suspicious, he gorged himself with opium, lapsing into an apathy bordering on imbecility until he had taken his accustomed dose and falling into fits of furious madness when he passed it, so that those who had business to discuss with him had only a very short time of the day to choose from. Most of the days, or the governors, had been bloodthirsty. This one exceeded them all. I was really struck by the clearly negative bias in this writing. And he was writing about one of the governors in Algiers, the capital of Ottoman Algeria. And so in my talk today, I'll describe where that quote fits into this overarching kind of research context. I'll describe the methods I used for my study, my findings, and then the validation of those findings. So the research context, as I mentioned, this research focuses on the history of Ottoman Algeria, so prior to the French conquest in 1830. And I'm specifically focusing on the eastern province of Constantine. So here on the screen that's shown in this kind of light yellow color on the right side, that's the province of Constantine. And that really came under Ottoman rule between 1567, and it didn't fall to the French until 1837. So this whole research project got started as I began to investigate the French period of the French period of Algerian history. And I ran across the memoir of the last Ottoman governor of this province, Haj Ahmed Bey. And so I began wondering how representative he was. So I finished my first project. And then for my second project, really dove into the Ottoman period of Algeria's history, starting with this fascinating governor whose memoir I had. And his story kind of led me then back into the past. And I began asking questions about who were the other governors of Ottoman Algeria and began putting my sources together. As I did that, one of the questions we always have to ask as historians is how reliable are our sources? And so I had closely read my sources, but I was wondering if there were computational methods I could use that might help me uncover something that maybe I missed in my close reading of the text. So the sources that I'm going to focus on today in my talk are these three French language sources. There were many others that I used to corroborate my study, but these are the three that I did kind of a deep dive text analysis on. Two were written by 19th century French scholars who were living in Algeria. They are chronicles of Ottoman Constantine and the governors of that region. And one was written by a 20th century Algerian scholar, which is also a chronicle of Ottoman Constantine. And all three of them are based on an original Algerian text written by one of the scribes for the Ottoman governors. And he came from a long line of scribes in his family who worked for the governors. And so what the French scholars then did when they came in the 19th century is they took that original Algerian text written in Arabic at the time, and they did further research and corroborated those stories, or in some cases revised them based on any documents they had access to, which unfortunately have since been lost, also the oral histories and songs and poems that still existed in the region. They incorporated all of that into their chronicles. So these became really good sources to begin to uncover who the other governors were in this region, what their lives were like, different features of their stories. And for a separate part of this project, I created data sets based on all of that information. But as I mentioned, I began asking questions about how reliable were these sources? Was there evidence of bias, like we saw in that first quote that I shared, where that first quote written about a governor in Algiers, not in Constantine, so a different city, but that writer often wrote in very dramatic and very negative language like that. So I was curious if these three scholars also had some of those either anti-Arab or anti-Turkish biases present in their texts, because I needed to take that into consideration as I put my data sets together. So as I began working with the texts themselves, I split each of the books into 46 different documents, one for each of the governor's terms. And that led to a total of 138 documents and about 183,000 words. So this is not a huge corpus. So I do some validation of this method later with another kind of small corpus and then a much, much larger corpus. So I'll describe that towards the end of my talk. So some of the questions I asked as I approached these texts included, were the author's perspectives and language consistent across the chronicles for each governor? Did common topics and themes cut across the chronicles? And most importantly for my talk today, what bias is evident in the documents? And then was this bias operating during the Ottoman history described in the sources or at the level of presentation, or was it both? So to delve into those questions, I used a combination of topic modeling and sentiment analysis. Both of these methods already existed, but by bringing them together, what I was hoping to be able to do was to identify any bias that was present in my text, but also I was exploring a method that might be used by other people who might be new to natural language processing, who might be maybe new to computational methods, something that wouldn't require someone to understand large language models or need to do a lot of coding. And I wrote a lot of the code, and I've shared all of the code that I used for this project in my GitHub repository, and I can share a link to that if anyone's interested. So I began with topic modeling because I was curious about this question of themes, and did themes cut across these different ways of telling the history of Ottoman Constantine. So a topic model presents topics, which are groups of words that appear near each other in statistically significant patterns throughout the document collection. The topic modeling algorithm weights and ranks each word in each topic, and then each topic in each document. The specific algorithm I used is one that's commonly used, especially among humanities scholars, to do topic modeling, and that's the latent Dirichlet allocation. So here's an example of a very small model with only 4 topics, but it'll give us a sense of the kinds of information that we can pull out of a topic model. So the algorithm gives us the topic index number, the topic weight, and the top words. I've translated the words from my French sources into English here just because my presentation is in English, but I do have all the originals again in my GitHub repository. So here we see there are 4 different topics in this model. What I did after I analyzed the top words in each of the topics is then to add a label to understand what each of these topics was really talking about. So we see in the first one, the words general, road, south, column, chief, region, situation, command, France, cavalry, battery, indigenous people, and Kasbah and Kabyles. And so as I read through that and understanding the history and the context of the documents, I labeled that topic as the French invasion. And we also see topics on religion, colonial power relations, and then the biggest topic, the most important topic, the one that's most represented in the corpus is, of course, on governance and succession. Since isn't surprising because the sources are chronicles. So this appears throughout each of the models that I built. This is the most significant topic. But I was curious about the other topics that also emerged. So for example, in this larger model, I discovered a topic that I called religion and governance. So what I noticed is as I developed larger models, meaning models with more and more topics, the topics got more granular, and that also revealed the richness of the history that the chronicles reveal. And after I constructed the models, then what I could do is identify a topic of interest, and then go in and look at which documents, in this case, which biographies of governors from the chronicles were most closely related to that topic. So it gave me a way to explore and interrogate the corpus in some new ways. So here's kind of a quick overview of my methods. So of course, cleaning and preparing the collection of documents, which is always necessary. Not the most fun part, but certainly necessary. And then I used coherence scores to identify the numbers of topics to run. So it's a way of identifying how coherent the topic models at different levels are. And so I use those results then to identify the different sizes of models I would build. And I wanted to construct a hierarchical topic model. So I have topics at different levels. So I have models at different levels. So I had a model of 4 topics, a model of 7, 11, and 20. And what I noticed, as I mentioned, is as those models got larger and included more topics, much of the richness of the history emerged. Things like stories about women and the Spanish in Algeria and also Jewish people. And so I'll delve into some of that analysis in just a moment. So after I generated the topic models using Mallet, I then assessed and labeled the topics in each model. And then on the models, rather than the original text, on the models, I ran the Vader sentiment analysis package, which was really, really interesting. And I'll show you those results in just a moment. And then finally, I went through and created concordances to validate the sentiment analysis scores. And then I did close reading. And what I found is that my subjective reading, my human, with my human eyes and my own mind, the sentiments I noticed in the text very closely matched what the model had produced, even though it was running just on the topics, not on the texts themselves. So I have a lot of confidence in the resulting output of this method. So I know this is too small to actually read what's all in the text, but this is a quick visualization of the sentiments associated with each of the topics. And I have this in a Tableau workbook. It's also, I can create an interactive version of it so you can actually see all of the different top words in each of the topics. So this is for the 20 topic model. This is the largest model I created and the most detailed. And what I was really curious about, again, because I was looking to see if there was bias present in the author's writing, I was really curious about the topics that were labeled negative with a negative sentiment. So as I mentioned, I used the concordance method, which means I was looking for particular words from the topics and the context that appeared around those terms in the original documents. And as I mentioned, I again went back and did more close reading of the documents again, based on the topics I found that were interesting. So as I mentioned, I thought there might be some anti-Arab or anti-Turkish sentiments in these chronicles. I didn't notice much in my close reading, but I wanted to double check and make sure I hadn't missed something. But what I found was that actually there really wasn't any anti-Arab or anti-Turkish bias present, but there was a latent anti-Semitic sentiment that appeared in all 3 French language accounts. And this really surprised me. So I began to delve into this to understand, was this a product of the experience of Jewish people in the Ottoman period of this history, or was this an example of French and Algerian anti-Semitic sentiment of the authors who were writing? So let me step back and share how I discovered this. So I created a model with 10 topics, and then the coherence scores had indicated that an 11 topic model might be more coherent. So I ran that and compared the 2 models side by side. And what I discovered is the topic that I labeled councilman in the smaller model transformed and kind of split into 2 different topics in the larger model, one of which I labeled malfeasance because it included some of the same terms from the smaller model, but then it had some really interesting additions. So you can see that this topic was probably coded negative, and you'll see evidence that, yes, it actually was a very highly negative topic. As you notice the words empty, cruel, complaints, prison, this is not a happy topic at all. And right in the middle of this, the word that really stood out to me as I looked at this very negative topic was the word Jews. So the word Jews was related to these other terms that appeared to be quite negative. So here are the results then of the sentiment analysis on this topic. And you can see that by topic weight, it's not the most significant topic in the corpus. but it was one of the most negative. So we can see the compound score on the far right there, and that's the overall sentiment score associated with this topic. And these scores run from -1 to 1. And so we can see this is likely one of the most negative topics within this model. And again, the visualization kind of showing that. So I'll provide a couple of quotes of where conversations around the history of Jewish people and Ottoman Constantine appeared in the text. And then I'll show you at least a snippet of the concordance method I used. And then I'll dive deeper into the analysis. So one of the authors wrote, "Despised and mistreated by the Turks, the Moors, and the Arabs, these unfortunate people are only allowed to wear black or dark clothing. If an individual of this nation commits the least offense against the government, he is burned alive. The Jews who want to convert to Islam are obliged to become Christians first. They have their particular judges taken from among them, but they can appeal to Turkish justice." So one more quote here from Aperçu d'Algérie. It was published in 1830, the same year as the French conquest. So in Algiers, so this is Algiers, not Constantine, but it provides some context for what was happening kind of in the larger region for the Jewish people. In Algiers, a neighborhood was assigned to the Jews, and they are forbidden to live elsewhere. None of them should leave the states of the regency without first furnishing surety for his return. They deal in industry and trade. Often they associate with European Jews, who are called Juifs francs, because they enjoy, under the protection of a consul, all the prerogatives of other Europeans. So we can compare this kind of larger context then to the instances where the word Jew or Jews is referenced in the original text that I was looking at with reference to Constantine. So this is in French, but it shows the snippets of the context around the term juif or Jew in the French language chronicles. The document number on the left there tells me which document to go back to actually dive into that text further. So again, I know it's hard to read, so I'll share the stories that emerge from using that concordance method in just a moment. One of the basic questions I realized was probably important to take a look at was to figure out how often do these references appear, because I had not noticed an anti-Semitic bias in the text, even though I had closely read through them all. And it was because, as you can see here, the references were quite few. In the work by the Algerian author Gaïd, he only references Jewish people twice in his entire chronicle. Bayset mentions Jewish people 13 times, and Mercier mentions them 27 times. And so with this quick pie chart, I realized, okay, Mercier's writing contributes more to this topic. There are more references to Jewish people. But at the same time, I should also highlight that numbers don't tell the whole story. So even though Gaïd only references Jewish people twice in his accounts, both references are in highly negative contexts. He's not necessarily writing about Jewish people in a derogatory way, but the experiences that he's sharing are highly negative. So one of the first stories that emerges in the text, and one of the most extreme descriptions, was of one of the governor's treatments of Constantinian Jews. The governor was Salah Bey, and he served in the last quarter century of the 18th century in Constantine. And Mercier mimics much of Bayset's account. So these are two authors that I'm studying, and I'm analyzing their depiction of this history. And both of these authors note that the result of Salah Bey's Jewish relocation policy, they describe this in quite different terms. So in Salah Bey's governorship, he decided to create a neighborhood specifically for Jewish people and resettle them there. Previously, they were scattered throughout the city, and as the authors highlight, there was some tension between the Muslim population and their Jewish neighbors. And so Salah Bey, by one account, thought, maybe I can lower those tensions by giving the Jewish people their own quarter. In other accounts, this policy takes on a slightly different cast. So Mercier comments that the Jews, quote, were forbidden to stay elsewhere, which gives this kind of a different read. Whereas Weisset whitewashes this harsh reality by commenting, this is how the Jewish quarter was constituted to the great satisfaction of all. So Mercier, to some extent at least, seems to recognize this disenfranchisement that's inherent in the ghettoization policies of this governor. Mercier also seems to point to perhaps the pre-existing Jewish quarter in his relation. So there was a neighborhood that was predominantly Jewish prior to this policy, and that just kind of happened organically and naturally. But after this policy was instituted, all of the Jewish people, no matter where they were living in the city, were relocated and were forced to live in this specific quarter. So one last quote that I'll pull out here. So following the Jewish people's relocation to this quarter, Mercier notes that the Jews were sequestered in this district. Until then, they, as I mentioned, they were established all over the city. Oh, apologies, this is very sensitive. So this is the quote that I just pulled from Mercier. The Jews were sequestered in the Chara district. Until then, they were established all over the city, inconveniencing the Muslims and troubled by them. So he's highlighting some of the tensions, the social tensions that existed in Ottoman Algeria. But again, the context in which the Jewish people are being described is not entirely, certainly not a positive situation. The second account that appears in all three of the chronicles was much, much more negative. This account that appears in all three chronicles describes the deaths of three Jewish, very influential merchants. So Gaid writes in his account, now he was the Algerian author writing in the 20th century, but in the French language. He writes, but Hajj Ali Pasha, angry and bloodthirsty, suspicious and vindictive, did not know how to appreciate the services rendered by his collaborators. After having beheaded the Jews, Bakri and Ben Duran for illicit trafficking, he subjected the same fate to all those who had commercial relations with them. Suspected of complicity, including Ahmed Tobal, who had delivered them some time ago 3 loads of wheat. Mohammed Nauman Ben Ali succeeded him, meaning Governor Tobal. So Ahmed Tobal was the governor in Constantine. He was put to death simply for having done business with these 2 Jewish merchants. And what I would like to highlight here is that the references to Jewish people in all 3 chronicles solely relate brutal experiences, as if their only roles in the history of Ottoman Constantine were either as objects of hatred or as instigators of problems. All 3 accounts, including, and perhaps unwittingly, Gaid's, align with a French colonial narrative of Jewish weakness that began circulating during the ruthless French military campaigns of the 1830s and 1840s. The authors may then be accused of presenting narrow views of Jewish actors, at the very least, even if not prejudiced representations. Granted, Jewish actors are not the focus of these chronicles, but to truly understand the political machinations, especially in the 18th century, we need a much fuller description and understanding of the Jewish merchants as integral connective tissues in the intertwined Mediterranean financial and political systems, with Algiers and at times Constantine serving as operational bases of some of the most influential economic actors in the Mediterranean basin. So this was all really interesting for my study on Ottoman Algeria, and I included this in one of my book chapters. And then I wanted to also see if this method would work for other corpora, or if this was an anomaly, if it just happened to work with the chronicles I was using. So I'll briefly describe two comparative corpora that I put together and ran this combination of topic modeling plus sentiment analysis to see if it also worked for bias detection. So as I prepared the corpus from the Revue Africaine, I skimmed through a number of those articles, and this corpus was also fairly small. This was my first test because I had to do all the preparation and cleaning of the data and re-OCRing the scans. So this particular first corpus was, as you can see here, quite small. It was very similar in size to the original. So I had 191 articles, much larger in terms of total word count, though, 592,898 total words with over 50,000 unique word forms. So I skimmed that and decided to test this method on that one. I also decided to do a much larger test with a corpus that, while I was familiar with the context, I hadn't read. So the next corpus I tested this on included 3 19th century series on French Algeria, which included 23 volumes published around the same time frame, so 1838 to 1858. It included 969 documents, in this case, document segments, split into 5,000 words each, for a corpus total of more than 4.5 million words, so a much larger test with over 113,000 unique word forms. So here are the results of the sentiment analysis for the first corpus, that small one. And what we see here is a couple of topics here that appeared to be fairly negative, and I was curious about these two topics. The one on naval battle didn't surprise me. It's about battle, so it's not shocking that that might be negative because it's going to be talking about death. But the other one was about markets. I was really curious about that. So here, sorry, my Zoom panel is in the way. Just a moment to update my view here. Okay, so what I found for Revue Africaine is that the French authors approached Algeria's distant past, specifically its Roman past, with reverence. This was not surprising given all of the other material I had read, particularly from the French colonial period. And they also included descriptions of contemporary Algeria, which evinced the 19th century scholars' commitment to objectivity. But the algorithm, meaning the topic modeling plus sentiment analysis, identified topics on markets and Greek Ottoman naval battles as moderately negative. Like I said, the latter is unsurprising, but the former raised some new questions, which I don't have time to delve into here, but okay, well, I did a little digging about the market aspect because I wanted to test this method and see if it was actually working. And what I found in my concordance approach and close reading again is that the context in which they were writing about markets was indeed negative. Not extraordinarily so, but it did seem to match the sentiment analysis results that appeared in this test. The next corpus, the much larger corpus, was also really interesting. And here I ran a 28 topic model for this larger corpus, again, using that same method of running coherence scores on the different numbers of topics and identifying a model that would be as coherent as possible at 28. and then running sentiment analysis on those resulting topics. And what I discovered, the second most negative topic is understandable. There we go. Sorry. Too many things on my screen here. So the second most common topic for the negative sentiments was one on rebellion and the suppression of rebellions. But I was really curious about the first topic that I labeled colonial question, which was the most negative topic in this corpus. And it focused on the question of whether or not France should keep Algeria as a colony. And again, just going back to the time frame, these articles appeared starting in 1838, and when they were printed all the way up through 1858. But this topic was really relevant in the 1830s and 1840s as France was trying to decide whether or not to remain in Algeria and try to colonize it. So the author of these articles, Le Plan Barry, believed that it was the lack of knowledge about the state of things in Algeria and its benefit to France that led to what he described as the problem. Or in many cases, he referred to it as, quote, the evil, which continued to increase, by which he meant the desire to abandon the colony. So the evil he was talking about was abandoning Algeria. And he was making an argument that France should remain in Algeria, continue its conquest, continue its colonization, and maintain Algeria as a part of the French Empire. So he writes, variable and irresolute because it does not know enough. Public opinion pushes power, sometimes in one direction, sometimes in another. All attempts are tried and abandoned. Hesitation succeeds hesitation. Years pass consumed in impotent efforts and sterile sacrifices, and evil increases by evil itself. To remedy this, it must be known in a positive way what are the real interests of France in Africa. That is to say, why, for what purpose, by what means it is necessary to keep. So quickly summarize the results of these tests on this method. So the issues of revue africain, as the sentiment scores indicated, maintains a mostly objective tone. The two topics I highlighted as moderate to moderately negative were not overtly so, especially by comparison with the other two corpora that I examined. So it maintains an objective tone with little negative bias detected, either computationally or through close reading, because I did go back and do some more close reading after I ran the algorithm through the topic model and the sentiment analysis. The French Algeria corpus, the second corpus that I examined in this comparison, however, shows evidence of prejudicial views, both strongly negative, especially with regard to the idea of abandoning Algeria, and strongly positive in favor of maintaining the colony by any means necessary, colonization and exploitation of Algerian resources. So the method appears promising, at least so far, for French language corpora. I haven't tested this method with other languages or with more modern text. So further testing does need to be done for validation, but as I mentioned, it seems promising. And so I wanted to share this in case it's of use to others. I would be very curious if you try this method, what your results are, if there are tweaks that you would suggest, ways that we can improve on this approach. As I mentioned, all of this does come from my new book, and I can drop links to that in chat if you would like to know more. If you are located at a campus, you will likely have access through your campus library. So the first link should actually show you if you have access through your library, or you can simply do a search for it. The second link is for Amazon if you'd like to purchase it. It's available print and digital, and it comes with tutorial videos and additional resources and data sets to practice with if you want to actually try these methods and you want kind of a step-by-step guidance on how to use them. So with that, I will wrap up my talk and welcome your questions.
Thank you, Ashley. That was absolutely fascinating. I feel like I have learned so much. I have taken many, many notes. Thank you so much. That's fantastic. Do we have any questions? So if you do, please do put them in the chat or please put your hand up and we can ask them. But if you don't mind, I have a question to kick things off, which is, I just wondered what your close reading looked like and I suppose in what order did you do the close reading? Did you do the close reading based on the results? And I suppose then you kind of knew what you were looking for. And if you were agreed with the results that was coming from the sentiment analysis, or did you do a full close reading having not looked at the result to kind of, I don't know, to kind of compare the result of your human close reading with the sentiment analysis?
That's a great question. The first time around, I close read the sources before I did the text analysis because I used the sources to put together my data sets. So I had one data set on the governors and different features of their experience. And then I had another data set on the social networks in Ottoman Algeria. So I had to do really close reading to pull out all of those details. So I was already very familiar with the documents, which is why I was so surprised to find evidence of bias because I had already been through them with a fine-tooth comb. So then I went back now with that information from the sentiment analysis and then went back to see, okay, if I read through these passages on Jewish people, can I see where that negative bias might be coming from? And so I was able to validate the first model in that way. With the next two, I had skimmed through the articles, so I kind of had a sense for them, for the articles from Revue Africaine. And so, yeah, it made sense that that model was mostly neutral. It was fairly objective. And then with the last corpus, that was so large, I didn't have time to read through. I just quickly prepared the documents, cleaned them, and ran it through. And then I went back into the documents after constructing the model to those passages that were highly correlated with the negative sentiments to do that validation and see if my close reading after the fact matched the sentiment scores. Yeah, and as I mentioned, my close reading matched the scores I was getting, even though the sentiment analysis was running on the topic models themselves, not the original texts.
Thank you. Okay, does anyone else? Yep, James, you've got your hand up. Please go.
Hello. I lower my hand. So I really like the focus here on trying to find what you describe as the latent bias as opposed to trying to identify and describe the kind of the classic ways we often think about bias, like adverbs, for example, that kind of like are quite descriptive. I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit more about the broad character, particularly in the kind of chronicles you were looking at, the broad character of the writing. And what I mean here, I guess, is the character of the French. Because when I read it in translation, it read quite bureaucratic to me. It read, I think you called it objective at one point. And it read, therefore, as the kind of language that wouldn't. So you obviously found Jewish people broadly being described as Jewish or Jews, but it read like the kind of English, if it were in English, that you wouldn't find those kind of allusions to Jewishness you find in English that do not use the word Jewish, right? That do say, cowardly merchants, for example, or do use phrases to do with clannishness, for example, which you would find in English texts, which kind of often the English texts that are more obviously pejorative makes the Jewish characters hard to find. Now, I don't know if there's equivalents within French, and I'm sure there is, but I guess my point is, if I'm really curious about how you just thought of it as French. And sort of, I guess I'm also thinking a little bit about some of those techniques you find in NLP, perhaps more the corpus linguistic side of NLP, about sort of thinking about sort of negative keyness and kind of understanding the extent to which a corpus is, what sort of type of sort of language it's not using that is common within the French language. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about sort of the language of the French. So I don't know the French, being not
Yes.
being French.
Yeah, so within this corpus, the chronicles, these three chronicles in particular, especially in comparison with the chronicles written about Algiers, were written in a very, I would say, a very even-handed way. Like people who are described as behaving badly, all the sources, not just these three sources, agree that these were pretty terrible people. And they go into detail about what these people did. And you're like, well, yes, I could see why you'd use the term brutal for this person. And so I was really struck by, yes, their even-handedness in their description of the governors themselves, who were, many of them were ethnically Turkish. There were a few European slaves who became governors, which is a whole nother story, and a few Algerians and a few mixed ethnicity folks. And the chronicles themselves read like fairly dry history. They try to stay as factual as they possibly can, and they cite like, okay, this information comes from, this oral history that was passed down by this tribe. This is how we collected it. Here's the information that corroborates that. Again, that really struck me in comparison with the chronicles on Algiers, which were written in a much more dramatic, flamboyant way, kind of designed to inflame people's emotions. And to characterize the Ottoman governors as tyrannical and oppressive. And these accounts were being written between the 1830s and 1870s. This was an era where France kind of needed to prove that it had justification for its conquest. And especially when focusing on Algiers, they tried to make that case through really inflammatory language. And so the chronicles on Constantine really stand out as something quite different, where these were scholars who were trying to write scholarly works about the history and get it as accurate as they could. So it was a very different sort of project. I really appreciate your comments about the other kinds of ways that Jewish people, for example, have been described in ways where the writers are not using the actual term Jew or Jewish. They're using other language, coded language. And I really didn't find evidence for that in these chronicles. If they were talking about a Jewish person, they mentioned that this person was Jewish. They didn't use coded language, like scurrilous merchants or something that would be highly negative, but you wouldn't necessarily know that that person was Jewish unless you did some digging. I really didn't find allusions like that in these particular sources. Now, if this was the kind of thing you were looking for in other sources, yeah, you'd probably have to expand the vocabulary that you're looking at to do those comparisons and find ways in which Jewish people are being described in texts. So these texts did, at least in that way, make my job a little easier. They weren't using a lot of coded language where you might see it in other places.
That really helps, thank you. And I guess that's what I hoped you were going to say, because I think coded language would stand out really oddly and otherwise quite bureaucratic, or as you call it, kind of even-handed text. Can I just ask one quick follow-up that's about then the use of Veda? Because I don't want to get in the weeds of like different sentiment analyzers and whose sentiment and stuff. But it strikes me in a way from what I know about Veda that the kind of more even-handed, matter-of-facty kind of speaking is the kind of text that Veda's probably quite good at handling in terms of being quite, shall we say, correct at doing sentiment, whilst once you get into the more emotive and more linguistically complex kind of spaces, it can sometimes break down, not at the kind of whole corpus level, but at some individual passage levels or some document levels can break down because it's sort of the complexity of the language kind of slightly evades it's a weird sentence, evades Veda's ability to find that complexity and understand its kind of negative or positiveness. Was that something, I guess I'm guessing Veda is something you use because you feel as a rule-based tool, you have more sense of its kind of strengths and weaknesses. But I'm just interested then about how you felt Veda behaved in these kind of slightly different contexts.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked this question because this was something I gave a lot of thought to. And I chose Veda for several reasons. One, because I was running it on the topics themselves rather than the texts. I knew I didn't need something that would handle a lot of kind of nuanced complexity within the language it was analyzing. And Vader was trained on social media, so it was trained on short, kind of pithy texts. And that's exactly what topics are. And so I was really curious to see how it would perform on kind of similarly short chunks of text. And as I mentioned, just based on my own small samples, it performed really, really well in this context. Would I use Vader on the texts and documents themselves? No, I would not. I would choose something that would handle that complexity in a much more nuanced way. So I'd choose something that was not rule-based. The other reason I wanted to use something that was rule-based is it's really easy to explain how that works when you've got a set lexicon. And it was already trained on French. So I also needed something that would handle the language itself. And I wanted to find something that would be user, maybe not friendly, but at least approachable for someone who is brand new to this and wanted to try this for the very first time. I knew I needed to find a package that was lexicon-based and fairly easy to tweak and tune. So Vader kind of checked all of those boxes for me. Yeah, so those are all the kind of the behind the scenes rationale of that choice.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat from Sophie Whittle, who said, thank you so much for this talk. Do you think these computational methods might work for medieval data? Did you need to standardize the data from the corpora in any way? For example, are there any differences between 18th century and present day French which you needed to take into account?
Yeah, really, really good questions. Yes, I think these computational methods would work well on medieval data. What I would suggest is running your topic, if you do this two-step approach, run the topic model on the original texts as they are. You might need to do some standardization of the spellings of words, because I know just from my early modern work that can be really idiosyncratic. So you might need to do some of that standardization just to make sure that the topic model works correctly. But then go ahead and let it run through the text after the standardization of spelling. And then any cleaning that you would do subsequently would be at the model level. And that's a lot more reasonable than doing much more fine-grained cleaning of the texts themselves. I mean, even standardizing spelling is a heavy lift for these texts. So I wouldn't want to suggest having to do a whole lot more than that. And I don't think you need to do a lot more than that. One thing I didn't mention is I created custom stop words lists because there were a lot of proper names. And because those proper names were transliterated from Arabic, the topic model didn't know to remove them. And so I had to remove those from the consideration of the model. Yes, and then the other related question about differences between 18th century and present day French. With these particular corpora, I was dealing mostly with 19th century French, which is very, very similar to modern French. And so when I ran the sentiment analysis, I wasn't terribly worried because the meanings of the words hadn't really changed much since the 19th century. If I were running this on early modern versions, I might want to maybe do a more careful validation process to make sure that the results matched my, maybe not close reading, but at least using concordances where you've got particular terms coming up that you're interested in, or going back to some of the documents that are most closely related to topics of interest, and just doing some very careful validation that way.
That's great, thank you. Do we have any more? Sophie says thank you as well. Do we have any more questions for Ashley? Yeah, Alexandra?
I was kind of waiting for someone to jump in the chat, but thank you, Ashley. This was so interesting. I may have just missed this because my brain is a bit addled, but in terms of the relationship between the chronicles and the original sources, you mentioned, right, that many of these sources no longer exist, that they've kind of disappeared. So I was wondering, kind of thinking bigger picture, or like almost quasi ideologically here, what do you think that this approach, because obviously, we're all very convinced by this approach, it's fantastic, but, what do you think that this approach then might give us as historians who are maybe struggling with some of these issues of, absolute, I guess, data absence, right? If we don't have the original sources, but we have these very, very highly mediated, highly 19th century. I mean, the language that James is talking about, I mean, it's so 19th century. This could only have been written in the 19th century in terms of, the prose being used. Is this offering us some kind of new future, some new opportunity as historians to kind of mitigate areas of kind of historical scholarship where we have lost our sources? I mean, is that what you see as kind of the bigger project almost of what's going to come from this type of, I guess, more case study based scoping type research? Is that what you kind of see as the bigger picture here and the bigger future? I'd be really interested to hear that, because I mean, I imagine that some historians would have some real pushback against that. You yourself as a historian would probably also have see the limitations in that approach, but is that where you're kind of boxing your corner for?
A bit, but the way that I approach that particular problem is a little different. And that really came through as I developed data sets on these governors and their families that really echo kind of the original Ottoman sources, but those Ottoman sources have been lost. And so to fill that gap, I put together my own data based on the information that we do have. And I also corroborated that information, not just with these chronicles, but with many other sources. We have travel writing, and we do have some Algerian sources I was able to pull in and corroborate this information. We also have consular letters from Algeria that go back to France, and thankfully those have survived. And so I was able to corroborate a lot of this information with other sources, maybe not the sources I would have wanted to work with, but using really standard methods that other scholars who work in the Ottoman Empire in these places, or asking questions that are really difficult to answer with the sources that do remain. And so, yeah, doing that kind of careful piecing of the puzzle together with whatever fragments we have, I think is important and necessary work. And we have to always provide the caveat that these are our sources. Yes, it's not perfect, but this is what we're left with, and this is what we can do with it, but also here are the limits, and being really careful about identifying where those limits exist. In the rest of this book project, I talk a lot about missing data, the absence of information, and the stories that in and of itself tells. Like, again, we might not be able to answer the questions that we want to because the source materials are missing, but the fact that they're missing also tells us something important about this history.
Fantastic. Thank you. So just before we finish, are there any other questions for Ashley? Oh, James has got his hand up.
Yeah, can I ask you about the bit at the end of the title of your talk? The in the era of AI bit.
Yes.
Presumably this is there because there's a kind of methodological agenda that you think is really important right now that we attend to, and that there are methods and approaches and practices which have been carefully developed over the last couple of decades, which we're at risk of losing, chucking away, or just sort of not realizing like a lot of what you talked about here, particularly in the Q&A, is about the choice of things which were very carefully chosen in order to construct a research process that you felt could produce things that you, I'm guessing, hope historians who don't use computational methods can see the robustness of, even if, and I think we always say this on this seminar, that those historians often hold us to a higher kind of standard they hold to themselves in terms of how they think about the rigorousness of their methods. So is there something there about, like, there's you feel like there's a need for some sort of pushback against some kind of methods are ultimately lazy, we don't know much about, and might lead to us losing a whole bunch of mean, historians have been doing quantitative work for a while, and there is a good history of that, right? So sorry, I've kind of rambled about that bit, but I'm really curious about that kind of throwing into the title kind of bit.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing me back with this, because I did forget to delve into this. So with AI can be really powerful. Large language models are really promising. I have another project where I want to use large language models and neural networks to identify individual people who are mentioned in the text, not just named, but also unnamed, and their relationships. This is still an unsolved problem in natural language processing. And so I think there are certainly some excellent uses for the technology that has become more available and accessible. However, if those are the only methods we're turning to, we do miss out on other opportunities. And so as I thought about this, one of the questions that kind of nagged me as I was finishing up this book project and thinking about this chapter in particular is, now with AI, like, would this method be useful? Or could we accomplish the same thing with AI interfaces for our document collections? And I would suggest, at least with this method, I would need to think about some of the other kind of traditional NLP tasks, if AI might replace some of that. But at least with this, like, I would have had to have a sense already in advance of what I might find in order to prompt and ask the right questions framed in the right way for an AI interface to generate the kind of information that I ended up finding using this method. Because if I just asked it to identify bias in the text, I don't think it would have pulled out these particular examples. And so I'm saying we shouldn't completely avoid AI. I think there are really exciting frontiers to explore, and I will be doing this exploration myself. But I also think there's a place for some of these traditional methods first. And I think it's also helpful to understand how these unsupervised models, some of these original unsupervised models, work and function and what they can do for us before maybe we jump into some of the work with LLMs and AI.
And I guess what I get you're getting to is that there's a fundamental difference between starting with a set of historical questions and constructing a series of methods to try and find ways of understanding how that operates, versus constructing a prompt for a language model and saying, go find this stuff. And they're totally different, radically different research methods. And one has a clear sense of kind of scholarly sense of purpose, and the other is more based on a kind of heuristic of search. And they're really quite different things. And I guess if I take off my convener hat and put on my programming historian hat for a moment, like, that's the kind of conversations we're having at the programming historian right now. Is like, which of the the long estate of articles that we have actually are methodologically rich in ways that still are robust enough to keep going and keep supporting and keep updating in quotes an era in AI, and which are actually kind of more mechanistic step-by-step things, which probably AI processes will just do for you much quicker than learning this thing here. And that's how I think about search as being much more, it's not entirely mechanistic, but much more mechanistic than the kind of the research process construction and iteration, I think, that you're talking about, because NLP is ultimately very iterative as well. So yeah.
Yep.
Okay. You made me think a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, I would be happy to continue that conversation too. Yeah, I think a lot of us are going to be thinking about the kind of the nexus of questions surrounding methods in AI, and what is still important to learn how to do, and what can AI do more quickly and efficiently.
Fantastic. Thank you. If we don't have any more questions, then we will wrap up there. Thank you so much, Ashley, for sharing such rich research. I know that everybody in the room has taken so much away from this. So thank you so much. And thank you for being our first speaker of the year too. Thank you to our attendees. Please join us for our next seminar, which is on Tuesday, the 19th of November. We'll be joined by Colin Greenstreet, who will be speaking on AI agents for historical research, a new skill set for historians, and that will be online on Zoom. Same as tonight's. James has just put the link in the chat. But yes, thank you to everyone. We will upload this to YouTube afterwards, and thank you to Ashley again.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.